You have to just remind yourself, okay, but maybe I'm missing something. Let me consider this person's opinion also. And I think being educated in two different systems really helps, because when you're educated in the Soviet Union, again, we had great education, at least at high school level, and you believe in this theory, workers, the capitalists, etc. And then, I was 15, I was in high school, and I told the teacher, okay, but why do the managers and workers always have to fight? Don't they have common interests? If they work in the same company, if the company makes profit, everybody wins. You could see I was a latent American. So the teacher called my father and said, I love your son. That's why I'm calling you and not certain organizations. Please talk to your son because I cannot have this in my classroom. But being brought up in that system and seeing the holes in Marxist theory, even then was easy. But then when you make it to the West, it becomes more obvious. But then you start seeing the holes in Western way of thinking. Liberalism is a great thing. It's a great thing. I'm all liberal. I mean, I wouldn't be listening to BBC under my bed at night, with my shortwave radio if I weren't a liberal. I do believe in human dignity, human freedom, freedom of speech. By the way, how liberal is that? To call anybody who disagrees with you Putin's puppet? Is it liberal? Is it really? I had to quit my university because of all this pressure that was applied to me, but it doesn't matter. So liberalism is a great thing, but number one, it's not perfect. Our democracy is not perfect. It has great flaws like lobbyism, corporate influence, private interests, manipulation of the media, fabricated consent. There are a lot of weak spots. And number two, not every country is ready for it. And number three, you can't do it by force. Just like Jack Matlock said, you should do it by persuasion. How were the Soviet citizens conquered? I can tell you exactly how, because I was one of them. Why did we start loving America so much? Music, film, ideological influence, cultural influence. You can just see that this way of life in many ways is better. Persuasion, that's what worked. America didn't invade the USSR and force us into capitalism. It did not do that. It was much wiser back then. So invading countries and forcing them to adopt your ideology and regime is never, almost never, a good idea. It's funny because all this wisdom of the American political elite of late 20th century, where did it all go? I mean, Americans knew how to do this. They didn't invade the USSR. They converted us by persuasion, by example, by their culture. This is what should have been done.
The funny thing is, or the interesting thing, is that the other two great powers, the Russians and the Chinese, are currently deploying that strategy way more than the US. I mean, they're not trying to lead by force. Okay, you have force in Ukraine, in the Donbass, yes. And you have, if you are Georgian, then you will immediately say, hey, we have two provinces that were basically clipped off by force. Yes, that's true. But in the way that they try to appeal to the global majority, they try to appeal first and foremost with a couple of principles: the equality of states and principle of non-intervention. This Russia and China are touting those, and they're trying to show how economic development can be done that doesn't lead into becoming a vassalized state like a lot of Europeans to the US, right? And they try to then say like, hey, we are open for business. And this is in a kind, it was the US strategy in the Cold War, right? To appeal to the others while also doing all of the regime change and so on and so forth. I mean, it went hand in hand, but at least the public appeal was a much more open one than what it has become now. Would you agree?
It's actually what I told my American colleague years ago. I said, what's so funny is that China is now behaving like the United States in the late 20th century. And the United States is behaving like the Soviet Union. This is what is so strange. I mean, all this wisdom went away. And yes, exactly. China is using economic influence, cultural influence, technological advances to really spread its influence in this world and slowly, just like America did, slowly conquering the world, but in a different way, not militarily, not by invading countries. And the last 25 years of US foreign policy, I mean, I'm very sorry. I mean, with all my respect to those people who stood behind it, I love them dearly, but it's very difficult to call it a success. I mean, look, Iran, Afghanistan, Libya, Georgia, Ukraine, Syria, not to forget this horrible, horrible events. And by the way, you're talking about liberalism and human rights and international law, and you bring an Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra leader to power in Syria, and then you go to shake his hand, and then you give him a makeover like a teenage movie, those teenage movies with makeovers, 16-year-old girl who got a facial and curlers in her hair. What is this?
all of this, you can still put makeup on a pig, right, and sell it as a free lady. You can still do that, but I mean, it's even worse. I mean, look at what this did to the United States. I mean, the U.S. promise was that, look, you will become like us, and we are wealthy and prosperous with TV sets and meals at home and so on and so forth.
You were, and you were.
And now we have a generation which is going to be poorer once they reach their parents' age than their parents. I mean, while China, that is being demonized, has lifted 800 million people, 700 million people out of poverty into the middle class. It's like just
exactly right.
The comparison doesn't work anymore. You can't portray this one as a failing system and yourself as the shining city on the hill. Reality kicks in, and actually the rest of the world, I believe, sees that. If I talk to people, especially in Southeast Asia and also from Africa and so on, they go like, yeah, we see this.
I'm not an expert on China, but from what I know, is a country where 50 million people died of hunger after the so-called Great Leap Forward.
Yeah.
50 million people were eating anything they could find, rats, insects, to survive. And then China adopted the Western model in a very intelligent way. There's a guy called Deng Xiaoping.
Yeah.
And now China rules the world. And in the US, we became the Soviet Union. We started wasting our money, $14 trillion. It's a number I've heard. Enormous waste of our resources, declaring wars all over the world and losing them, not even winning.